Only in California would we allow 28 million acre feet of fresh water go to the ocean and then propose expensive desalination plants to take the water back out and remove the salt.
SGMA is a new law in California enacted in 2014 that for the first time in California's history governs the use of groundwater to ensure that the water supply is sustainable for future generations. It's a new thing for the state. Ironically, California is the last state in the West to have a law like this, and it really was enacted to ensure that the water supply would be here for future generations of farmers and communities and the environment.
Before flood control in the state of California, before dams and canals and reservoirs, that water came out of the mountains and it flooded this valley and it built our underground water aquifer. And it was replenished year after year after year.
And that's the reason why our groundwater levels have dropped, is because we don't have the surface water deliveries that we used to depend on that would come every year.
And until we get the water for surface deliveries, it's not going to stop. And in my opinion, the answer is not retiring farm ground.
You know, we go back to 1991 with the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, and they grabbed 800,000 feet of water out of the west side in one fell swoop. And you say, okay, that happened. Now we're here 30 years later, and what has been the result? And the answer is the species continue to decline, whether it's salmon or delta smelt or steelhead. And obviously, something else needs to be done.
We do depend here in this county on 20%, about 5,000 acre feet of water, and we know after the last 2 decades that that's about all you can depend on your state water contract.
My concern started before I was aware SGMA was being discussed. And if you take a long view of agriculture, you have no choice but to protect your groundwater.
We've been diverting water from other users for over 20 years, and the Delta is not in a lot better shape. I think we have to do a better job of how we define success.
When you talk about SGMA, there has to be a balance.
If you take a glass of water and put a handful of dirt in it and let that settle, of course the better water is going to be on top. Right now we're drinking the water from the bottom because we've stopped putting water back on the top.
We have an incredible groundwater storage reservoir under our feet that we've pumped dry. And that supply can be replenished there a lot cheaper than building surface storage. Surface storage reservoirs are costing upwards of 10 times the cost per acre foot of water that we can store in the ground.
There's a graph that I just saw last week that shows the last 12 months of water that's come out of the Sacramento, American, and San Joaquin rivers into the Delta, and about 84% of it was flushed out under the Golden Gate Bridge.
Production funding for American Grown, My Job Depends on Ag, provided by James G. Parker Insurance Associates, helping to protect and grow Valley agribusiness in California for over 40 years. By the Gar and Esther Titillion Charitable Foundation, a legacy of giving to support the people that make agriculture grow. Farms feed families, public television feeds minds. By Brandt, Professional Agriculture, supporting the heroes that work hard to feed a hungry world every day. By Unwired Broadband, today's internet for rural Central California, keeping Valley agriculture connected since 2003. By Harris Farms, a tradition of working forward to protect the future of water, ranches, and farms in California and beyond. And by Valley Air Conditioning and Repair, family-owned for a half-century, dedicated to supporting Valley agriculture and the families that grow our nation's food.
So reservoirs still play an incredibly vital part in California's water supply and distribution system. Short of building new ones, the existing ones provide essential services to us all. They capture water during snowmelt and rainfall. They keep that water behind the reservoir for dry periods. They also are used for flood management, so that when large rain events occur or large heat spell brings in melting snow, we're not wiping out our communities and farms downstream.
We were doing right from the start, and we never stood a chance. Honey, you tear me apart, and I bury deep below this avalanche.
The solution to every water challenge that we have in California is build more surface water storage. We need above ground storage. When Mother Nature shows up and brings us water, we don't have any place to put it except in the ocean. This year alone, we have lost 28 million acre feet of fresh water because there was no other place to store this water. 28 million acre feet, that is a year's worth of water for 280 million people.
The trick is to rethink the use of the reservoirs as part of the overall storage system so that they can meter out that water, not necessarily just for irrigation and community needs, but to actually meter it out to put it back in the ground. Right now, most reservoirs are kept as full as they can be kept into the summer. And also at the end of the summer on a wet year, water is held in them till the last minute before a storm and then released. We could reoperate our reservoirs in ways that release that water more slowly so that it could be picked up in the fall, such as the fields behind me here, where recharge could occur when it's not a flood control risk time of year.
The Central Valley Project, in part, was built to bring water to the arid regions on the west side of the valley. And it was amazing that, you know, this is one of these public investments that have paid incredible returns. Once the water came, the higher quality, you could grow a greater selection of crops, higher value crops. And it's that surface water that has allowed us to move away from grains and cotton and melon to pistachios, wine grapes, almonds, all kinds of things out here. And so from a public investment standpoint, probably one of the best ever.
You know, one of the things about environmental uses of water is it just flow? Is just increasing flow is going to improve the environment? There is a developing belief that it isn't, that what needs to be improved is their environment and the way that these ecosystems are operated. Most of the delta is an artificial now facility. It's all channeled between levees. It's not the same environment it was 150 years ago. There isn't the habitat that there used to be, because in you know, the 1800s there would be floodplains and so forth. And also we have all these invasive species in there that impact the native species. We have to acknowledge that we have to overcome that somehow, or our native species are not very competitive with some of these invasive species. And we keep throwing water at them, and our native species, like the smelt, can't compete with things like striped bass.
Again, my family didn't farm on the west side until the early 1960s, and the Central Valley Project had been kicked off, but we didn't receive our first water deliveries until 1967. When the project was first developed, a 40-year contract was executed with Westlands and the Bureau that gave us 1.1 million acre feet of water a year at a cost of $7.50 an acre foot and a 50-cent per acre foot fee to fund drainage that everyone knew was necessary but never came about. And so we've gone from $7.50 an acre foot to today we're paying over $200 an acre foot for allocation. But worse than that is the allocation now has been reduced, where I've only received 100% of my contract twice in the last 23 years. And our average allocation through the last 15 years has been about 34% of contract.
Oh, excited for you now.
The environmental interests and influence in the state grew, and so a lot of this water that was actually running through the San Joaquin Sacramento Delta, which is the state's largest estuary, had a number of environmental issues. And so in '91, there was legislation passed to divert some of these waters towards environmental restoration and mitigation and what have you. And that really dramatically impacted federal contractors along the west side of the valley. So we lost a lot of our surface water. In losing the surface water, the region went back to pumping more and more groundwater.
So California has two critical pieces of water infrastructure, and they are the pumping plants at the State Water Project and at the Central Valley Project. Without these, the lower part of California absolutely wouldn't exist. So it is imperative that these pumps operate. What happened in 2008 and 2009 is we had these smelt and salmon biological opinions, and they had guidelines that regulate pumping that were designed to produce a rebound of endangered fish. The problem with the regulations for pumping is that they make it where there is a certain date on the calendar where pumping is reduced, regardless of whether or not there are any fish in the area.
A regulation like SGMA is never going to affect everybody equally. There's going to be disparate impact on some farmers in some communities. It's not necessarily a question of who's a larger farm or a smaller farm, as much as a question of where people are and what water rights they have currently to surface water. There's a lot of farms whose entire creation relied on pumping groundwater that have no access to runoff from the mountains. Those farms are the ones that are great at risk with SGMA, because they're the ones that are going to have to restrict their pumping to come into sustainability. The farms with surface water are also going to have to restrict their groundwater, but they have a second backup alternative for where they get water. So it's going to come down to those that have surface water and those that don't have surface water, and how they're going to set up trades or arrangements to be able to survive.
The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, I'll refer to it as SGMA, state legislation that was passed a couple of years ago with the goal of protecting our groundwater here in the state of California. From someone on the coast, and we're in a coastal county here in San Luis Obispo, we've always depended on our groundwater. We don't really have delivered water.
All right, you guys, big day, right?
Good day.
What are we doing here?
Harvesting some grapes, some zin.
We have our drought cycles just like everybody else, but we haven't outgrown the ability to ensure a safe water supply to our incorporated cities. Otherwise, the agricultural industry kind of evolves around the water availability. So if you were going to put in an irrigated crop, you would find a part of this county where the water was plentiful and available. If you were dry farming, or if you owned property that the water wasn't available, you dry farmed, and it was as simple as that. Kind of took care of itself. In the last couple of decades, we've seen more pressure on our groundwater in places that were never irrigated before. And as a matter of fact, the irrigated, especially with the grapes and the wine industry moving in, we have tens of thousands of irrigated acres that we didn't have here in this county 30 years ago.
The surface water will vary. I mean, that's certain. So we need a cushion for low years. That's the groundwater. Now, for some people, they don't have surface water, so they only have groundwater. But in every case, whichever version you're in, you need an ample and reliable groundwater supply.
You know, the west side is criticized often for being, wasteful and growing these water-thirsty crops. But the change in agronomic activity out here has been breathtaking. On 9,500 acres that I farm and manage for others, every acre is now drip irrigated. And I often tell some of my urban friends, just to put that in perspective, if you took a 747 and took off from San Francisco Airport with a big spool of drip tape on the tail, you could fly to New York, fly around the Empire State Building, fly back to San Francisco, fly around the Transamerica Building, then go to Washington, D.C., fly around the Washington Monument, and then fly back to San Francisco and land. And over those 4 passages over the continental United States, you would still have tape left on that spool of drip tape that I laid out and installed on my farm in 1 year.
The recharge issue is something that's not going to go away until our irrigation districts get the right amount of surface delivery water for our customer base here in Central California in our ag region. We've had, and during our drought years, we've had some water districts that their water year was 2 weeks long. We've had other water districts where their water year is 90 days long. And when you have a crop that takes 9 months to grow, you're going to have to supplement it with some other water someplace. And our alternative has been below us. So until we get a system in place where we can capture more water or give our growers water in a timely manner. This year, again, allocations in the Westlands Water District have been limited, and we don't know how much water is available until our rainy season's over, and therefore, when additional allocation's given, it's too late.
One thing that's kind of puzzling if you're out here and you're dependent on water, and water's our limiting resource, is we have systems in place that could bring good, clean, higher quality water to the region that we're really not using as much. And that good, clean, quality water would allow us to grow more crops. It would allow the local communities to have greater access to higher quality drinking water. And by virtue of limiting this, we're now using, the less surface water, the more somebody has to pump. And I believe the pumping has an impact not only on how many acres we can farm and what crops, but it also has an impact on the local communities and the quality of the water that they get.
The answer is to save the water, to give the water to the farmers so that you can eat.
So today we grow carrots year-round. We have carrots that we plant during late August, early September, and we harvest them usually during December and January. But due to the amount of rain we've had this year, everything was delayed to where we're just getting in to get these carrots out now. So the ground's hopefully dry enough to where they can get a few loads out today, and then tomorrow they're going to take 30 loads a day out until they finish. Well, I think the response from the growers to sustainable groundwater management has been the reliance on groundwater pumping, especially during extreme periods of drought when we don't have surface water supplies, or if we only have groundwater supplies to pump to irrigate our crops. So we look at the underground water as a reservoir that we can tap during droughts, during periods of low rainfall in most areas, but also in many areas like where we farm here, it's our only source of water is the groundwater. So when we talk about groundwater recharge, typically the water flows from the Sierra Nevadas down the rivers and streams and enters the underground aquifer. The underground water is linked to the surface water. So the more water that's applied to the surface on primarily the east side of the valley, where it's sandier, more porous, the water actually travels through the ground and starts to build up the groundwater in that region. From there, it tends to flow to the center of the valley, which is where we are. We're probably the low point in the valley. So the underground water will flow from the east to the west. And we've always relied on that flow to replenish our groundwater in our area.
Farmers have been the water users. They've been the ones pumping the water out of the ground. They've always thought of the water being delivered to them by an irrigation district or being able to pump it for free, essentially, out of the ground. As we face water restrictions, farmers are now starting to be part of the solution to securing their own water future by capturing water when it's available on rivers and putting it back in the ground underneath their lands. So essentially, they're taking water storage into their own hands and storing it rather than waiting for someone to manage or change or build new reservoirs or build a new canal. They're making use of that water today.
Okay, so we're on the carrot harvester. It takes 2 rows and it loosens underneath them, and then it actually pulls them up by the tops of the carrots. So it's really important we keep healthy tops on these carrots all the way to harvest. And as they move up the conveyor, they get it knocks the dirt off them. They come around, the carrots get the tops cut off, the tops go back into the ground, the carrots fall on the chains, and they come down underground underneath us, and they end up in the truck that drives along parallel to the harvester here. If you're going to do groundwater recharge, you want to have it in sandier soil, more porous soil, just like when you're at the beach. When the water breaks onto the sand, it disappears quite rapidly. When we put water on our sandy ground, it starts moving down toward the underground water supply and starts to rebuild it. And that's why groundwater recharge is so important. It gives an avenue for the water to reach the surface water to reach the groundwater and start replenishing our supplies. We have tremendous storage capacity really right under our feet. This is actually on this side of the road is all white area, which means it's no district, county jurisdiction. So it's a real issue for us out here because we rely 100% on groundwater. So what we've done during flood years is we've put a canal in along here, a small canal years ago, back in the mid-90s. And we were taking flood water when it was available, and we started in 2011 flooding wine grapes. Our neighbor thought we were crazy to do it, but we flooded wine grapes for probably 5 months during the spring, and we're able to put water back to the groundwater by doing that.
Farmers used to flood irrigate their crops in places where it made sense, and what was so amazing about that is they used the surface water to grow food and recharge aquifers at the same time.
SGMA has been debated a lot. There's a lot of folks saying that it's going to restrict farming, it's going to ruin the Central Valley's economy. The fact of the matter is we were doing that to ourselves already by overdrafting the groundwater.
So we know that our surface water supply is connected to our groundwater. And then when we do have less surface water, we're going to have more reliance on the groundwater that we have below our feet. We know that there are areas where we could put additional storage, where we could park water, to where we would take the pressure off the groundwater pumping. It's a coordinated effort between the surface water availability and the groundwater.
You either restore the surface supply that's adequate, or you farm less land. And unfortunately, the trend today in the political world is, well, that's simple. You just tell those big, rich, corporate farmers, quit farming their land.
Here it is, 25 years that they've been doing this. The Delta isn't any better today than it was then. Not one bit. In fact, it's worse. So is it our fault? I think there's a lot of other things going on in the Delta that's being kind of somewhat covered up. But I know there's something else that's hurting that Delta, and it isn't us taking out the water.
It's important that our legislators learn to appreciate it, and I think the way that they can appreciate it is to come out and visit us. I had 3 congressmen right here about a month ago, okay? They came out to talk about water. They were from Washington, obviously, so it was a water issue. But California could also stand to learn a little bit more about farming and how responsible we are. And to see that we're not abusing the land, we're not poisoning the environment, we're not mistreating our workers. We're actually pretty good employers. I think California farmers are among the best in the U.S., not just at growing crops, but of treating our people and treating the environment.
I've changed my mind. I'm not going back. I just don't fit right. And when I do, I feel something wrong. I feel something wrong.
Production funding for American Grown, My Job Depends on Ag, provided by James G. Parker Insurance Associates, helping to protect and grow Valley agribusiness in California for over 40 years. By the Gar and Esther Titillion Charitable Foundation, a legacy of giving to support the people that make agriculture grow. Farms feed families, public television feeds minds. By Brent, Professional Agriculture, supporting the heroes that work hard to feed a hungry world every day. By Unwired Broadband, today's internet for rural Central California, keeping Valley agriculture connected since 2003. By Harris Farms, a tradition of working forward to protect the future of water, ranches, and farms in California and beyond. And by Valley Air Conditioning and Repair, family-owned for a half-century, dedicated to supporting Valley agriculture and the families that grow our nation's food.